Hey, welcome to Tabletop Skirmish Games. I'm Lee, and in this video, I'll show you how I painted my Scion Tree Revenant with contrast paints, ready for a Warcry Warband. And here he is, and this is the model we'll be painting in the video here, and I'll go through step by step each stage and covering all the different paints we use. I'll also put links to everything used in the video in the description below. And I'm going with an autumnal theme for this warband, and I've also done some other videos, so if you want to check out the Kurnoth Hunter, you can see that video too. And I've also done another one on the bases, so if you're looking to make some woodland bases for any warbands, then that video's on my channel if you want to check that out. Okay, let's get started. So here's the miniature all primed, and for the primer I used the Citadel colour Wraithbone contrast undercoat and assembled with the Citadel plastic glue. The paints we'll mostly be using in this video are contrast paints, but we'll also use some layer paints for a dry brush and some technical paints too. The brush I mostly use is the Army Painter Wargamer character brush, but recently I've been really into the Kolinsky No. 2 and can highly recommend that, especially for the more detailed sections of the miniatures. And the first paint we're going to use is the Contrast Wildwood, and this is a nice dark brown that's perfect for any wood effects. And this is great on certainly on terrain, but for these tree folk this is going to work perfectly. And so I'm just putting it all over this bark section, and because this is quite a large section, I don't have to be too careful here, so I'm putting a fair bit of paint on the brush and then just going right in all the different angles, constantly moving that miniature so I can get it in and make sure it's all covered. And usually I'd say to start and end the brush stroke where you want most of the paint to build up. But I found with this model, there's so many bits and different angles, it's just a case of really working it in to all those areas and letting that contrast paint flow to the recesses, which it naturally wants to do. And so these miniatures were quite quick to paint. I thought they would take a bit longer, and I was a bit apprehensive going into certainly the Kurnoth Hunters, the bigger models, but it worked really well. I think the contrast paints suit the Sylvaneth perfectly, and you get a real nice natural wood effect from this paint. And we'll do a little dry brush later on while this paint is dried. But here we go, we keep going here, and on this section on the front I'm going to not cover it with paint all the way down because we'll do a little wet blend effect. So I'm just making sure we get the wildwood all over the top section, and then I'm really pushing and pulling that paint where I want it to go. So here where you've got the different recesses where you want that darker paint, you want more of the paint to sit and dry to give a shadow, I'm kind of pushing the brush in there and almost using the edges and the angles of the plastic to rub off some of that paint, and then that's going to sit nicely in those recesses for a shadow. Right, while that's still wet, I took some contrast Gryph-hound orange, and then I start putting that on this lower section, and you can see I put quite a bit of paint on there at first and wiped that off, and then I'm using the brush to spread it around, and then I'm going to push that up towards the brown and just let it bleed into that brown slightly. Then I wipe my brush off on some kitchen towel and I get a bit more brown contrast paint, the wildwood, and then I put that on the part where the two colours meet, and I'm really letting those wet paints blend into each other. And then I start just pushing and pulling it around and almost dabbing the brush on in sections just to give us a nice fade between that brown and orange. And this is a great way to use contrast paints. They really suit these wet blend methods, and it's something I really want to try and do a lot more with different colours and try and get some different effects as I experiment with it. But here I think it looked really nice and really natural to go from this wildwood to the orange. And then I carried on with the wildwood up to the top section, and we're going to do this similar effect on these bits that stick out of the top. So we're going to go brown up to a point, and then that Gryph-hound orange, and then do a little wet blend again with the two paints. I found that because these edges are quite sharp on these miniatures, it wasn't a good idea to use like a good or a new brush. So I would definitely not recommend using your more expensive brushes. If you've got the Kolinsky No. 2, which is a really nice brush, I wouldn't use that here, but rather choose an older one because it just really like sprays out the bristles, so it's not really good for the brush, I don't think. So yeah, I would just be careful with that. But yeah, I'm just working this paint in now, really pushing it in to those recesses and working it. And the idea is just to spread it around so it doesn't build up too thick, So you don't want to put too much paint on, but enough so that you've got enough to work with, and there's enough for it to seep into those cracks and crevices there. And on the raised areas, just wick that paint away with your brush. And if you find you've put way too much on, just rub the brush off on some kitchen towel, and then you can soak up that paint through the bristles and remove it from the model, or move it onto another section that needs a bit more. So we're looking for a tabletop ready standard, which I think is a good standard to go for, and the contrast paints suit it really well. One coat pretty much of each of these contrast paints, and you can get some really nice effects. Okay, now we're going back to that Gryph-hound orange, and we're going to start from the top and work our way down on these pieces here, and then work towards that brown, and then again we'll do that wet blend. So you can see you've got loads of time to work with this contrast paint, and it doesn't dry that fast, especially when you put it on quite heavy, and then so it's giving you plenty of time to act and move it around. But once you've got it as you want it, that's the time to leave it alone. Don't go back and play with it afterwards, because once it does start to dry and you start touching it, you can kind of ruin the effect. So just get it where you want it, blend it all in, and then let the contrast paint do the work. And they're really good at the colours bleeding into each other and giving some nice natural fades. And we're going almost real time here, so you can see that it's quite quick to do this and the effect. And now I'm just dabbing the brush, so I'm like almost mixing those in together and using the end of the brush as a kind of like just speckling it on and dabbing it across just to blend those a bit more, and you can see you get a nice fade. Okay, now we're going to tidy it up a bit, so I'm going to take some ceramite white. This is a base paint. Any base paint is going to be fine for this, and I'm just going to go over all the areas where I was a bit scruffy or I went over the lines, and I'm going to give this a nice coat and then let that dry completely before we move on to the next stage. And just be careful to make sure that that contrast paint is dried before you put this white on, otherwise the two will mix together and you don't want that. And there we go, I'm just going over this bit as well. They've got all these like metallic charms, so we're going to paint this white, then we're going to give it a coat of metal colour paint later on as well. And so I'm putting it all over, just really checking. This is the time to like take your time and really make it tidy. And doing this stage is really important to get a nice neat finish on the model. So you don't want to leave all these paints, because once you start putting the lighter contrast paints, you'll see any little mistakes come through, and that's where it can look scruffy. So I'm constantly adding this white paint in this stage of like tidying up as I go through all the miniatures, just to make sure it's really crisp and making sure there's lines where the two different colours intersect, making sure those lines are really neat and tidy. So taking your time here doing this stage is really going to pay off when the model is finished. Right, now we're going to go for some contrast flesh tearers red, and we're going to use this for the leaves that are on the very tips of these little branches that poke out from the top, and this is going to give us a nice colour and just break all that orange and brown up with a nice bright red at the end. And I didn't want it to look like fire, so I was careful not to use too much of this red, and so just using it on the leaves, and I'm going to dot it around a little bit just to give it a bit of variety. But it was important not to wet blend this flesh tearers red, otherwise we would get like a fire effect, and that's not what I was after here. So the kind of technique with the contrast paints is completely different from the traditional technique with the Games Workshop kind of paint system, where you use a dark colour and then build up layers, getting lighter as you go. And so this is almost like painting watercolours on a paper or canvas. You want to just kind of blend those colours together. You can start with light, dark, and then mix them together, wet blend them, and then do like effects like this little dapple effect where I'm just dotting this kind of brush. There's hardly any paint on the brush, but I'm just dotting it around, and that's going to break up that solid orange colour and just give it a little bit more detail. And once it dries, it's not going to stand out too much. It's still going to look orange, but it's just going to give a bit more to look at, and it's going to make it look a bit more varied and interesting. And I've also gone down the bottom here, and I'm putting just a bit of that paint on the very bottom tips, and then I'm going to start doing that like speckle dappling effect, going up it a little bit, just again to break up that orange, make it a bit richer, a bit deeper. And this almost looks a bit like a kind of shadow effect as well, and very quick and easy, and it's just a nice subtle finish to give this orange, make it really pop. And you can see there's hardly any paint here, it's literally what's left on the brush, and then just dotting it around, breaking it up. I don't want like a line of red and then between the red and orange. So I'm breaking that line up just by feathering it and then just dapping it on. And then you can see there, it's a nice subtle effect. And that's going to give us another fade. So we've got the fade coming from the top down with the brown and the orange. And then we've got another fade from the bottom going red to orange. And this is a nice little finish on the tops as well. Just wiping that brush on, just dotting it around. And then we're going to move on to the next stage, which is to get some base paint, Rakarth Flesh. And I've got this very vegan makeup brush, and we're going to do some dry brushing. And these makeup brushes are perfect for that. So really nice soft bristles, and I'm going to load them up with the paint, and then I'm going to work that paint into the bristles as much as I can, but then get most of that paint off on a paper towel, on like some kitchen paper. So I'm really working that into the bristles, getting all the paint off, and I want it to be a real dry effect. And before we do this, it's really important that the contrast paint we did earlier is completely dry. And so now I'm carefully starting on the more pronounced areas. And when you're dry brushing, I find just be careful at first, just so you can check there's not too much paint on the brush. And you can see here how subtle it is. And mostly I'm using downward strokes because the light source is going to be most of the time from above the miniature. And I'm going against all those raised edges, all the kind of jaggedy bits, and then giving that a nice highlight. And this is going to make it also look a bit like more aged. So if you're doing terrain, like I did with the Catacomb set, using this recipe of the Warwood and then the Rakarth Flesh dry brush gives you a really nice quick wood effect. And doing all these miniatures, there was 8 in the Warband, doing all this in one stage, it's really quick, and it's certainly quicker than doing edge highlighting and things like that, and it gives a nice effect. And then using it on just a little bit of the orange section as well, just ties the miniature and the colour scheme all together and makes it look like one kind of tree person, so it all looks like it belongs together. So I was going to cut this video down a bit shorter because the Kurnoth Hunter's a little bit longer than this one and almost real time, but I thought it'd be cool just to let it go so you can see exactly how long it takes to paint these miniatures. And it's really quick. I mean, this is pretty much, apart from the drying times in between and some little bits that I've cut off from the different clips, this is really how long it takes to paint it. And so not long at all. So this warband you could easily get ready in 5 to 6 hours maybe, and then a few hours on the bases. So on a weekend you can get these ready and have fun doing it. Right, now we're going to get some Nahailak Oxide, and this is a technical paint that's perfect for a ghostly look for the bodies and the weapon. And with this, it's different to the contrast paints. It almost feels to me like a chalky kind of paint, like a chalky finish. And so you want to put a fair amount of paint on, but you don't want it to pool as thick as you would with the contrast paint. And I found painting the other miniatures of the Warband first and kind of learning from those before I made the painting videos, like making my mistakes on those, is that if you let it pool, the finish isn't very nice. It can be quite patchy. So it really is a case of putting a nice amount of paint on and then spreading it around with your brush to make sure it's a nice even coat. So the key here is to get it nice and even. You could get a little bit more in the areas that need a shadow, much like you would with a contrast paint, but certainly not as much. And so really just give it a nice even coat all over, and then this is going to dry and give a really spooky look to the miniature. And if you wanted to use just contrast paints for this, you could use the Athematic Blue, and that's going to give a very similar colour. It won't be as chalky, so it'd be good to see how the two compare. And I'm going to paint my Nighthorn Warband with that Athematic Blue, and then you'll be able to see the difference. And they'll be the first warband that the Sylvaneth are going to battle with when I do a battle report for them. So you can see them both on the battlefield and check out and see which one is the spookiest. And now this time being really careful not to get this Nahailak Oxide on any of the other parts of the model, because it will leave a kind of chalky residue, and we don't want that. So I'm just taking my time, and you can see I've got quite a scruffy brush for this. I find with the technical paints I don't want to use my best brushes, so I'm using some older scruffier brushes just to get this on. And now I'm gone for a smaller, more detailed brush, and I'm going to use that to put some of the Nahailak Oxide in the kind of tattoos that are engraved in the wooden sections. And rather than trying to like paint within these really thin areas, I'm just kind of letting that paint seep off the brush and soak into the lines, into the grooves. And you see I'll use my finger just to wipe some of the residue away from the surface. And that's not the best way to do it. I recommend, instead of doing that, put the paint in and then wipe off the paint from your brush on some paper towel and then use it to wick away the paint from the surface, and that'll give you a nicer finish. But there you can see that that's gone into the detail there on the belt and the knee, and that's going to look like it's almost glowing. Right, now we're going to do the metal work. So we're going to take some layer paint called Stormhost Silver, and this is going to go on the little metal thing they have here, and a lot of them have got these hanging from them. This guy's got quite a few, so we're going to cover all of them with the Stormhost Silver. And then once we've done that, we'll let it dry completely, and we'll put a contrast paint over it. And this is another great use for contrast paints. Using them over a metallic paint gives some really nice effects. And I've done that a lot with the terrain, and I've found even with things like this, using a bright silver like this Stormhost Silver followed by a contrast paint gives a really nice effect, and it works perfectly for these Sylvaneth. There we are. So all those metal parts are getting just one coat of this. That's all we're going to use. And then while that's drying, I took some contrast snakebite leather, and I'm going to use that for the bindings that hold these on, and you can add that on there. And that's just going to give us a nice leather kind of strap effect. And really quick, again, just one coat of this, that's all we need. Just being very careful here not to get it to mix in with those antlers they've got. And that's just going to finish that off nicely. And once that silver paint was completely dry, I took some contrast Nazdreg yellow. This is a really nice kind of, not too bright yellow, but it's almost gold itself. And I'm just putting that over all the metallic areas, and that's going to give us a real bright, shiny gold look. And then once that one had completely dry, I took some technical paint, Waystone Green, and this is perfect for doing like emeralds and jewels, a really thick, like almost gel-like paint. And you put on a nice kind of blob, and then once that dries, it's really glossy and shiny and a really good effect to use. And if you put it on a bit thicker on one half and thinner on the other, you'll get a nice contrast, almost like a stone with different angles. But these are so small, I'm literally just putting a blob on each one. And as long as you get this on nice and thick, just one coat is all you're going to need. You can also use this for the eyes, for those familiar creatures they have with them. And there you go, you can see that's really shiny already. And that's our miniature complete, all done, tabletop ready, contrast paints, a quick dry brush and some technical paints. I was really happy with how this turned out. I decided to paint the model before I did the base because I want these Sylvaneth to feel like they belong to the ground, like part of the forest. And so it doesn't matter if I get some of the leaves on the painted miniature. And here's a close-up of the bases and what they look like. And if you want to see how I did those, I've done a separate video on how to make the woodland forest bases, so you can check that out. And that's something different that I used there, some different techniques that I hadn't done before. I've also done the painting video for the Kurnoth Hunter, and in both these videos, that's going to be all the techniques you need for the whole Sylvaneth Warcry warband. I'll put links to everything I used in this video in the description below, and there'll be affiliate links to Element Games, but they won't cost you anything extra. In fact, they could save you up to 20% on all the products, and for any sales made through those affiliate links, I get a small commission, and that's going to help me grow the channel, develop it, buy more cool stuff to do videos with. So thanks so much for that support. I really appreciate it. Let me know what you think about this contrast method for the Sylvaneth, what you like, what you don't like. It'd be great to hear your feedback. And so join in the comments section below. I really hope this video was helpful, and thanks so much for watching. Please like if you like it, subscribe for more videos like this, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to join me next time on Tabletop Skirmish Games.